Welcome to even one more video about taking photos of Aurora Borealis. I have recently released a video about what camera settings to use, and today in this second video I'm going to speak about what camera gears that I prefer to use. Now we're going to speak about what camera gears we need for take photos of Aurora Borealis. We must first make sure that there is a jungle out there. I mean, there is plenty of gears from different brands, and there is also not only cameras. I mean, today you can honestly take a mobile phone and shooting handheld you can get okay photos of Aurora Borealis. And if you also take one some-year-old mobile phone, and absolutely not the most expensive ones, with the right knowledge you can still get okay photos. And you can also get okay photos with one quite cheap camera, and you can of course also use one crazy expensive professional camera. And all those things going to give you different results. But the thing is that you can get photos with almost all the gears out on the market today. So I cannot sitting here and say that this is right, this is wrong, you must have this gear, you cannot have this gear. I can only speak about my opinion and my way to do it, how I am thinking and what gear I have preferred to use for get the best result possible when I'm shooting Aurora Borealis photos. When we're taking photos nowadays and we speak about getting a good photo, it much often depending on your skills, your eyes and how you're used to work than it depending on the camera gears. But when it came to taking photos of Aurora Borealis, the camera gears get much more important than in many other situations. Because even if you have a really good eye for what you're doing, you have the right skills, the difference between different kind of camera gears is actually huge, and you're going to get a much better result if you have the right working tools for what you're going to do. And taking photos of Aurora Borealis is something we do in quite extreme conditions. So it's really a big difference between different kind of camera gears, even that all gears can give you one okay photo if you have the right knowledge. The first thing we need is of course a good camera body. And after doing a lot of tests, a lot of research and also a lot of comparing, I have chosen to work with Sony camera bodies. When you're comparing different cameras, different brands and different models, I mean, there is a lot of things to compare, and it can be that one brand is better than the other on one thing, but some other brand can be better on some other thing. So there is no easy choice to figure out what camera you want to buy. Everything depending on your need and what you're going to use the camera for. But when I compare cameras, there is one thing that is much more important than all other things, and that is just because I'm so passionate taking photos of Aurora Borealis. And that number one thing is, of course, which sensor going to give you the best result when you are shooting in low light. And I have figured out that Sony sensors, especially some of the models, they are outstanding when it came to handle low light situations. As you maybe know, I'm taking photos of different kind of things. I mean, it's not only Aurora Borealis. I take everything from landscape to wildlife, and I'm also doing a lot of commercial shooting and also some weddings. So I have had the need to have more than one camera body. So now I'm working with 3 different Sony cameras. And of course I also use all the 3 bodies for taking Aurora photos. So I'm going to show you which are those cameras and what are the benefits with them when you're taking Aurora photos. And if we start with the first one, it's the Sony A7S III. And this camera is well known as a real low light monster. There is no camera on the market today, as I know, that can handle so high ISO levels as this camera can. I mean, it's crazy what you can do with this camera in low light. And this is the camera that I mostly use when I'm making real-time movies of Aurora Borealis. The biggest benefit with the Sony A7S III is that it can handle extremely high level of ISO without giving you a lot of noise. And as you maybe know, most of the cameras today have a base ISO on 100. And that means that the signal from the sensor is untouched. It's a pure signal, and you have the lowest amount of noise when you're shooting on ISO 100. And when you higher your ISO, you also step by step going to get more and more noise. And that's the same thing with this camera. Step by step you get more noise, but the thing is that this camera's sensor have 3 different kind of signals from the sensor. So you can basically say that this camera have 3 different kind of base ISO. Because when you go from 100 up to 1250, you get step by step a little bit more noise. But when you go from 1250 and up to 1600, then you again have a pure signal. You have like another base ISO. So on 1600 you are back to having a pure signal. And then from 1600 again, step by step you higher your ISO, you're going to get a little bit more noise. And again, when it came to 16,000, you have a new pure signal. And that means that you can shooting stills with this camera up to ISO 16,000 and have extremely good image quality. And when you're making movies with this camera, I used to shooting in 4K and in HD on ISO from 32,000 up to 51,200 and without have crazy amount of noise. And I mean, there is not many cameras on the market today that can handle a ISO of 51,200. The second body is the Sony A7R4, and this is a 61 megapixel full frame sensor. And this camera is my most common camera when I'm shooting for be able to make really huge photo prints. And when you have 61 megapixel, many people thinking that you're also going to get a lot of noise. And I also know that a lot of people have tried this camera and also think that they get a lot of noise. But the thing is that you don't get more noise with this camera than with some other camera with a lower resolution or less megapixel. The only thing is that the noise gets more visible with this camera. So of course, when you're shooting and you open the RAW file or your JPEG, you're going to see with your eyes more noise than you have been able to see if you have less megapixels. But here there is one very, very important thing to know when you're shooting Aurora Borealis photos. And that is that in post-production, when I do some kind of noise reduction, if I have a lower resolution or a lower amount of megapixels, if I do too much of noise reduction, I also going to lose a lot of stars in the sky. But I have noticed that with the A7R4 with 61 megapixel, the difference between a small noise and a pixel of a star gets bigger because you have the higher resolution and more megapixel. So when I do some very, very smooth noise reduction, it's more easy for the post-production program to know what is noise and what is not noise. So I can get almost all the noise away without deleting a lot of stars in the sky, because the difference between noise and not noise is much clearer because you have the noise more visible because of the more megapixels. So if you want to have a high resolution, high megapixel camera, don't be afraid using it also for Aurora photos, because the bigger amount of noise is not going to be any problem for you. And then one other thing with the A7R4 is that dynamic range on this camera, it's something very, very special. It have an extremely good dynamic range. And the thing is that you can have one good dynamic range on a paper, but if you compare two cameras with the same value of dynamic range, it can still be totally different. And if you're shooting in low light with this camera, you open the raw files in Photoshop and you're going to try to brighten up the shadows. You're going to notice that with the A7R4 you can brighten up the shadows extremely much more than with some other brand that have on the paper the same amount of dynamic range. The third camera body I'm using is the Sony A1, the Alpha 1. And sadly I don't have it here on the table because it's sitting on the tripod there and recording this movie right now. I can tell you about the A1 is that it's the main camera for me when I'm shooting wildlife, and I have bought the A1 because of the autofocus system and also because of the high amount of megapixel, high resolution, and also because of shooting 30 frames per second in continuous mode. So it's not the main camera I have for shooting Aurora Borealis, but of course I also use it for shooting Aurora Borealis. And the thing with the A1 is that it have the best benefits from two different worlds in one. It have the benefit like some other cameras, for example the A7S III, that it can handle extremely high ISO values without giving you a lot of noise. And still it have the benefit like the A7R4 that you have a high resolution, high megapixel sensor. So you really have the best of two worlds in one camera, and it's a perfect camera for shooting Aurora Borealis photos because you're going to get small amount of noise and you're still going to get high resolution for making prints or whatever. But the thing is that I can still not recommend the A1 fully out if you buy a camera only for shooting Aurora Borealis, because it's a very expensive camera and you're going to pay a lot of money for things that you have no need for when you're shooting Aurora Borealis. But if you need a camera for shooting sports, wildlife, weddings or whatever, and you're also going to use it for shooting Aurora Borealis, the A1 is a perfect camera with the two big benefits from two different worlds together in one camera. And if we then speak about camera lenses, I'm a little bit worried that it's going to be like a never-ending story, because there is so many good lenses out on the market today that working so well for shooting Aurora Borealis photos. And the number one thing when it came to lenses is, again, like with the camera bodies, the light. The light is the absolutely most important thing. And forget the best amount or the most amount of light. You need to have a camera lens with the biggest aperture possible. So for that reason I have chosen to only work with very fast primes with 1.4 to 1.8 apertures. And about focal length, it's more a question about taste, because you can shoot Aurora Borealis more or less with every focal length. So it more depends on how you want to compose your photos. And I am shooting Aurora with everything from 14mm all the way up to 400mm. And I'm going to show you now what lenses I mostly use when I'm shooting Aurora Borealis, and what focal lengths I use, and also a little bit why I use that kind of focal length. The first lens I have here is the widest one of all of the lenses that I'm using for Aurora Borealis. And it's the Sony 14mm f1.8, and this lens is extremely small and lightweight for being a 14mm with an f1.8 aperture. And I must say that I'm not a so big fan of extremely wide-angle lenses, so most of the times in other cases I use to choose 20 or 24mm before 14, because 14 is, in my opinion, a little bit too wide in many situations. And the reason is that I'm very sensitive for distortion. I don't like at all those crazy distortions you get when the trees are not straight and the horizon is a little bit bended. So I prefer to don't use so wide angle lenses. But when I'm shooting Aurora Borealis, it's one other thing. So then I'm using 14mm a lot, and there is a special reason for that. When you're shooting nowadays, you're mostly going to publish your photos on some kind of social media, for example Instagram or Facebook. And when you're going to put your photos there, you must crop your photo in 4:5. And because you're shooting in 2:3 and you're shooting in portrait mode, forget the biggest amount of the sky in the photo. That means that you need to crop away a lot on your photo. And if you have the 20mm or the 24, what I normally use, more than 14, you get a little bit too less of the sky. And forget more of the sky in the photo, you need to tilt the lens a little bit up. And when you're tilting a wide-angle lens up, you're immediately going to get those trees that are not straight, and you're going to get one horizon that is a little bit bended. And I don't like that at all. I want to have the things organized in the photo. So here the trick is that I use 14mm. Because with 14mm I can keep the lens straight, and I'm going to get the same amount and sometimes a little bit more of the sky than I should have get with a 20 or 24 if I tilt up the lens a little bit. So by using 40mm I can keep the lens straight, I can get a big amount of the sky in the photo and still have the trees and the horizon without distortion. And then when I must crop my photo for make a print, for example 5:7, or post it on social media 4:5, I only crop the lower part of the photo. So 40mm is really good if you want to capture a lot of the sky but still be able to have your lens straight, so you don't get that ugly distortion that you get if you tilt a wide-angle lens too much up. So if you're going to choose a 14mm lens or not, it's more about what taste you have, what focal length do you prefer. But if you're choosing a 14mm lens, I can really recommend the Sony 14mm, because it's a super sharp lens and with exceptionally good sharpness also in the corner, already wide open on 1.8. So I can really recommend this one if you want a 14mm lens. The second one is the 20mm, and also this one is one f1.8 lens. And this 20mm is maybe my most common lens when I'm shooting Aurora Borealis. But here again, it depending on what things I have in the foreground. If I'm not able to tilt the lens up a little bit for get more amount of the sky, I used to choose the 14mm so I can keep the lens straight. But if I'm shooting something where I don't have a foreground that is sensitive for distortion, I prefer to use the 20mm, because 20mm is my absolutely favorite focal length when it came to shooting landscape photos nighttime with Aurora Borealis. You get the perfect amount of sky, you get the perfect amount of compression, and I really like how the frame is looking when I'm using 20mm. So 20mm is my most common focal length. But if I need to tilt the lens too much up and I have a foreground that is sensitive for distortion, for example trees in the corner of the frame, then I choose the 14mm and keep the lens straight. And then we have the Sony 24mm f1.4 G Master lens. And this lens is a truly masterpiece. The 24mm is maybe the wide-angle lens that delivers the absolutely best image quality of all the lenses that I have here. But sadly, 24mm is not my favorite focal length, so most of the time I prefer to use the 20mm lens. But there is some scenarios where I also using 24. And for example, in the autumn, when the lake is open, when you don't have any ice on the lake, you just have open water, you get very lovely reflections on the water from the Aurora Borealis. And when I'm then shooting straight over the lake, and on the other side of the lake I have a lovely tree line or some lovely mountains, and I don't want to lose the size of it, then I prefer to shooting with a longer focal length like 24. And the thing is also that if I'm shooting over an open lake and I don't have any trees close to me in the corners of the frame, then I can also tilt the lens quite much up to get a lot of the sky without taking the risk to get some ugly distortion. So if it's open field and I'm shooting straight over a lake, I don't have anything that can make the frame looking strange if I tilt the lens up, then I prefer to use 24mm focal length. And then we have the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master. And this lens is also a really good lens that delivers perfect image quality. And 35mm is still in the category for wide angle, but it's not a super wide angle on a full frame camera. But I'm still using 35mm very often for shooting Aurora Borealis. And one of the thing is that, like with the 24mm lens, that if I have something that is far away from me in the distance and I want to keep the size of it, then I prefer to shooting with longer focal lengths, even that you get a little bit less of the sky. So when I'm, for example, up in the mountains and shooting Aurora Borealis with a lot of mountains in the frame, I prefer to have 35mm at least for keep the size of the mountains. And then the Aurora is maybe not the main priority in the photo, because I'm composing with the mountains with the Aurora as one ingredient in the frame. So then I'm using a lot of 35mm. So the most common lenses I use for shooting Aurora Borealis, it's the Sony 14mm f1.8, the 20mm f1.8, the 24 1.4 and the 35 1.4. And some of these lenses have better image quality than some else of them. Some of the lenses have some other benefits. But still, the thing that make me choose what lens I'm going to use is what focal length I need for this specific photo. Am I going to be in a tight forest with a lot of trees, or am I going to be in an open field with big mountains far away in the horizon? I always choose the length depending on what focal length I need for the situation. I never choosing the lens by what lens have the best image quality, because all of them have so good image quality, so there is nothing you need to think about. Just choose depending on what focal length you prefer. And then I have one lens that maybe not so many of you have tried. It's the 15mm f4 from Nisi. And the fun thing with this lens is that the main idea with this lens is to shooting straight to the sun. The aperture blades are cutted in a way that make you get crystal clear razor sharp sun rays or sun stars even on the biggest aperture f4. So the idea I get when I see this lens, even that it's one f4 lens, I think I will try it for Aurora Borealis. So I use the A7S III that can handle very, very high ISO values, and thanks to that I can shooting with this lens at f4. And if I'm shooting at f4 and I have the moon as one ingredient in the photo, I'm going to get the same effect as when you're shooting straight to the sun. So when I see this lens, I really got one idea that, oh, I must try. When the whole foreground, the whole forest is totally covered with snow, you have Aurora Borealis, and you also have a very strong full moon, and you can shooting and get the moon look like a sun star and with sun rays. So this lens can really give you specially kind of photos that are very unique, and I like to shooting this lens, even if I don't use it often, but when it's full moon and I feel for it, then I used to use this lens also for Aurora Borealis. And I have just tell you that 14 up to 35mm is the focal length area that I mostly use for shooting Aurora Borealis photos. But then we have also three other lenses we have the 50mm 1.4, we have the 85 1.4, and we have the 135 1.8. And those three lenses is absolutely not the first lenses you think about when you're speaking about shooting Aurora Borealis photos. But once again, everything depending on your goal. If your goal is to capture Aurora Borealis, of course, the wider the better, because you're going to get more of the sky. But if your goal is to compose a photo in a little bit other way, you maybe want to compose a good looking photo with some mountains and have the aurora there only as one ingredient in the photo. I mean, then you can use whatever focal length you want. And I start to using more and more longer focal lengths for taking aurora photos. The 50 and the 85mm lenses I mostly use when I'm shooting landscape in the mountain areas and with Aurora Borealis as one important ingredient. And that is mostly because I'm in big open fields with the mountains far away in the distance, and I want to keep the size of them. But then the 135 1.8 I have started to use for shooting wildlife in the middle of the night with Aurora Borealis as one ingredient. And believe it or not, but with the 135 1.8 together on the Sony Alpha 1, if I have a strong moon, it doesn't need to be full moon, but like a moon it is around 50%, I can still use the autofocus on the A1, and I can also use the animal eye detection in the middle of the night. And that is something that impressed me a lot, and I have started to be even more interested in it after I tried it for some weeks ago. So I'm going to start to use the 135mm lens much more for try to take wildlife animal photos in the night with Aurora Borealis. And when I tell you that the longer focal lengths, they are maybe not so common for shooting Aurora Borealis, maybe especially not the 135mm focal length, then I can really promise that 400mm is absolutely not common for shooting Aurora Borealis photos. But the thing is that when I realize that the 135mm working so well on the Alpha 1 in the middle of the night for shooting wildlife, I was thinking that I must try with the 400. I mean, it's a 2.8 aperture, so it's doable. I just need to gain the ISO a little bit more than I used to. And the autofocus system is also working with the 400 if I have a little bit of moonlight that lit up the foreground and the animal. The challenge with a 400mm lens for Aurora Borealis is that you get a very, very small piece of the sky. And if you want to have one animal and the Aurora Borealis in the frame, you must line up perfectly with the animal and the aurora. And because the aurora is moving very, very fast, so if the aurora is moving just a little bit, you must move yourself a lot for again lining up with the animal. So most of the time when I go out for aurora photos with the 400, I came home without anything because it's so hard to success. But when I finally get something, I don't know, for me there is something so special because it's not common to see 400mm photos of one animal with Aurora Borealis as one ingredient. It's like a totally crazy thing, but I have started to like it more and more, and because I figure out that it's doable, I promise you will see much more photos coming from me with wildlife, with animals and Aurora Borealis taking in the middle of the night. Because this is something that make me really excited nowadays. I want to challenge myself, and I all the time want to try new things. And this is the thing that make me not able to sleep nights when it's aurora. I must go out with the 400mm and see what I can do.